Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned because it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week is a very special episode because Roger and I are talking about Thor again. Because I am reading every issue of Thor from the first run of Thor, which ran from the early 1960s until the mid 1990s. And what I'm talking about today is the greatest run on Thor from that period. In fact, it's the greatest run on Thor ever. In fact, it's one of the greatest runs of any Marvel comic ever, and that is Walt Simonsons Thor. It's Walt Simonsons Thor I'll be talking about today, which I have in this enormous omnibus, which was recently reprinted for Marvel Comics. This is every issue from Walt Simonson's run on Thor, which I originally read some of these issues in the 1980s. I never read them all until recently because I didn't start picking up Thor until I started hearing how great it was. And so I missed the first few issues of this run. And I stopped reading it right around the time that Sal Buscema took over the artwork from Walt Simonson. Simonson was still writing the book, but Sal Buscema was drawing it. And I stopped picking it up around that time. I'm not sure why, because I really like Sal Buscema a lot, and I think he does some of his best work in here. Although the truth is, he's no Walt Simonson, that is true. But I started picking it up in the 80s, and I read it in the 80s, but like I said, never read them all until now. What a magnificent run. It's pretty great all the way through. There are some parts towards the end of the run where it sort of sags a little bit, I guess, by comparison with the rest of it, but then picks up with a magnificent ending. It's fantastic. So Walt Simonson's Thor. A bit of a word about Walt Simonson's Thor and where the book was at, the comic book was at the time that Walt Simonson took it over. It was kind of at a bad spot for Thor, because Marvel, I think, for a long time kind of couldn't figure out what to do with Thor. I'm not sure why. But yeah, they were having a hard time with Thor. He was probably at the low point of the comic book at that point, where the writers they had just couldn't figure out what to do with Thor, and the artists were not that great compared to some of the great artists that it had previously. You know, Jack Kirby, John Buscema, and so many others, including Walt Simonson. Walt Simonson had an earlier run on Thor where he did the artwork. But at this point, right before Walt Simonson took over the book, it was just like they were concentrating a lot on Thor's Earth adventures as opposed to his adventures on Asgard. They were concentrating a lot on his alternate identity, his human identity of Dr. Donald Blake. Dr. Donald Blake was kind of a holdover from when the book first started, when Stan Lee didn't really know what he was going to do with this character Thor. I think Stan Lee's original conception of Thor was kind of a Captain Marvel type character. Captain Marvel as in the Shazam version of Captain Marvel, you know, the original one, where you had young Billy Batson shout Shazam and he turned into Captain Marvel. This was kind of similar in that Dr. Donald Blake, lame Dr. Donald Blake, lame in more ways than one, found this magic walking stick, and when he pounded it on the ground, he turned into Thor. And he didn't really have Thor's personality, the personality that Thor eventually developed in the book when the Thor comic first started. It took until Stan Lee and Jack Kirby started doing a backup strip called Tales of Asgard that I think Stan Lee and Jack Kirby really realized the potential of this character and started working Asgard more into the Thor comic. And Thor became pretty great. But it took a while for Thor to become great. And Dr. Donald Blake, this idea of a secret identity for Thor, which was really kind of unnecessary, he was kind of a holdover from the beginning of the comic. And for a lot of runs on Thor, whoever was writing Thor would just forget that Donald Blake even existed. And Dr. Donald Blake would just disappear for like months at a time, which caused him some problems when he would show back up. But I think Walt Simonson realized where the book was at when he took it over. And Walt Simonson took everything that was great about Thor. He was heavily inspired by the early Jack Kirby stuff, and just created this magnificent world and this great hero. And he just did a fantastic job with this series of books. And he started off in a really interesting way with his first issue, where he introduces the character of Beta Ray Bill. That's Beta Ray Bill here. This is the artwork from the first issue that Walt Simonson did, where we have this space alien crash land on Earth. But before that, we have these early pages where we have this mysterious character somewhere pounding out on an anvil, and the word doom at the bottom. Now, who is this guy? And what's going on here? Well, this scene of this demonic character pounding something on an anvil, it was a giant sword, of course, would reappear throughout the early issues in Walt Simonson's run. And it was like a mystery. What's this character doing in the beginning of every issue? Well, it turns out it was Surtur the fire demon, who wanted, of course, to destroy Asgard. It should be noted that no matter who does a run of Thor, Asgard will be in danger and invaded or attacked or taken over. And then we go to Dr. Donald Blake, the lame Dr. Donald Blake, who is not going to be in the comic for very long. So S.H.I.E.L.D. comes and gets Thor and tells him about this alien ship which crash landed. And we also get our first look at Loki. Loki, of course, the main villain of Thor, and becomes very important in Walt Simonson's version of Thor. And Thor goes to check out this mysterious crashed ship. And this is our first look at Beta Ray Bill, the alien that crash lands, who it turns out is an incredibly powerful alien charged with protecting his people, who are kind of refugees and looking for a new homeworld. And they're all asleep in cryogenic sleep, but he's awake to protect them. And he comes across Thor. They have a big fight, and he's incredibly powerful, and he does something that nobody else had done before. He separates Thor from his hammer. Thor becomes the lame Dr. Donald Blake again. Beta Ray Bill picks up his walking stick and pounds it against the side of the ground there, and he becomes Beta Ray Thor. It turns out that Beta Ray Bill, this alien character, is worthy to lift Thor's hammer. And he gets the power of Thor. And while this is happening, Odin calls Thor back to Asgard. Odin shows up to call Thor back to Asgard, but he accidentally brings back Beta Ray Bill, because Beta Ray Bill now has the power of Thor, which leaves Dr. Donald Blake kind of high and dry. And starts off the initial storyline. I should take the dust jacket of this thing off, because it's slipping around. And then you can see this magnificent wraparound cover that this thing has underneath the dust jacket. Look at that. That's awesome. This is a great book. Anyway, we have our initial story of Thor, where you have Beta Ray Bill show up in Asgard. And it turns out they're both worthy of holding this hammer. And Beta Ray Bill, as it turns out, despite being a horrific looking alien, he is worthy to hold the hammer of Thor. So Thor creates a hammer for Beta Ray Bill, and Thor and Beta Ray Bill become great friends. And despite his horrific appearance, the Lady Sif kind of falls for this guy, this horrific alien, because he's so noble and good. It was an interesting thing. And what, of course, Walt Simonson was trying to put across here is that, it doesn't matter what you look like. You can be a noble hero even if you have a horrific appearance. Right? Right, Roger? Roger tells me that all the time, how noble and heroic he is. Despite looking like... Anyway, Beta Ray Bill features in that first story. And like I said, Odin creates a magic hammer, a mystic hammer for Beta Ray Bill, just like Thor has. So he's basically another Thor. He's an alien Thor, which was an interesting way to start the book. And that was pretty great. And one of the great things about Walt Simonson's run is he really started delving into the other characters, like Sif, for example, and came up with storylines for all of these characters and motivations for all of these characters, including the Lady Sif and including Loki. Odin gave Beta Ray Bill the ability to change into a normal version of himself, and took away it, because Beta Ray Bill was this genetically enhanced alien creature who the rest of his alien species found repulsive because they were more human-like. They weren't human, but they were human-like. And Beta Ray Bill gave up his humanity basically to become this hero of his people. And so Odin gave him the ability to stamp his hammer on the ground and become like a normal version of his people. But that made Thor lose his identity of Dr. Donald Blake, which none of us, all of us were happy to lose Dr. Donald Blake. He was nobody's favorite, frankly. But he had to come up with his own secret identity whenever he went to Earth, he felt like. So he came up with this identity of Sigur Jaron, which basically, he would just carry his hammer around in a knapsack and wear glasses because, glasses are the tried and true disguise for superheroes. It's, you just put glasses on, nobody knows who you are. Whenever I put these on, you're like, who are you? I know. But yeah, and we delve into Loki more. Now, Loki I love because he's just so damn evil. Again, every issue, we get these scenes, these mysterious scenes of this character creating this magic sword. And as it turns out, he is Surtur the fire demon, who eventually shows up and attacks Asgard. Baler the Brave is one of the more interesting characters in this series. There's Baler there. Baler the Brave, who's been around in the comic book forever. But he went to the land of death. He went to hell, basically, and had to get it, and got out of hell. But his experiences in the land of death left him, well, kind of traumatized. And his experiences there were very traumatic. And so he has to get over this PTSD, basically. And one of the things he does to try to block out his horrific memories was he would like overeat, and he became the big fat Balder. And when I first started reading this comic book, I thought Balder was just like a big fat guy. I didn't know any of his backstory. But, he has to overcome his own demons and become the heroic Balder once again, which he does. And he's probably one of the most interesting characters in this whole run of Thor. And of course, eventually Surtur comes to Asgard and with his legions of demons, but they also attack Earth at the same time. They also attack New York. And so we have this huge, gigantic invasion of both Earth and Asgard. And it's fantastic. Of course, I'm skipping over a lot of stuff because a lot of stuff happens in this comic. Beta Ray Bill is called back to help fight off Suitor. They all charge across the Rainbow Bridge, and it's magnificent. And, here's Balder in Carnella. Carnella is the Norn queen, and she's kind of a villain. And Balder the Brave is the most honorable, honest, heroic hero of all. And they're in love with each other, and have been for years and years. But Balder just has not been able to accept it because she's evil, basically. She's a villain. So it's an interesting relationship, and it's probably the most interesting relationship in the Thor comic book, Carnella and Balder. And Walt Simonson actually develops this relationship between these two throughout his run on Thor. And it was really interesting. Look at that. Fantastic. The artwork is just incredible. Like I said, Walt Simonson had an earlier run on Thor, but the artwork was not at this level. He had really developed as an artist. I mean, he was great in his original issues of Thor, but by the time he took over the book in the 80s, he was just incredible. And he did some fantastic work on this book. And his invasion of Asgard, which, happened over and over again in the Thor comic book, was particularly good. Yeah, this is the culminating period of the invasion here. When Loki, Thor, and Odin all stand together to fight Suitor the fire demon. Odin, Thor, and Loki are all standing together. And Odin is, "For Asgard!" Thor is saying, "For Midgard," which is Earth. And Loki is saying, "For myself." Because, of course, the only reason Loki is there fighting with his brother and his father is, because he himself doesn't want to die. And, of course, he himself wants to take over Asgard. And Suitor the fire demon, of course, is going to destroy all life. But by the end of this battle, Suitor is defeated by Odin, but Odin vanishes in his battle with Suitor, which leaves Asgard without a king. And of course, Thor is the heir to the throne of Asgard, but Thor is pretty dedicated to Earth, and he doesn't want to give up his protection of Earth for Asgard. So they have to find another king other than Thor to take over in Odin's place. And there's a period right after Odin dies where Walt Simonson takes a break from doing the artwork, and Sal Buscema does his first work on Walt Simonson's run of Thor. And Sal Buscema, who had been drawing comic books forever, I mean, he was used heavily in the 1970s. I don't know how many comic books he was drawing in the 1970s, a lot of them at the same time because he was fast. He did his first work on Thor, and he was really good. He did some of his best work, I think, on Thor. And this is the first issue that he drew. And it was really good. And I think Walt Simonson saw that, and he thought, you know what, I can take a break from drawing. Because Walt Simonson thought, Sal Buscema, he could take over for me when I need a break. And actually, he did take over for him eventually. He took over the artwork for the book. But Walt Simonson was still drawing it for quite a while. And we had a lot of other really interesting storylines. At one point, Thor is brainwashed by Lady Sif's sister, Lorelei. That was fun. And at one point, Thor turns into a frog, a giant frog, because Loki turns him into a frog. And we have actually several issues of Thor as a frog. working with a bunch of other frogs to defeat a menace to New York. It was interesting. One cool thing about Walt Simonson and his run on Thor is he never really took himself too seriously. He realized that this comic was not a super serious comic book. Although serious stuff could happen, like when Thor has to rescue some souls that have been taken into hell before their time, and they're human souls. And so Thor, he creates, or he puts together a party of Asgardians to journey into hell. And meanwhile, there's a whole 4-issue miniseries that happens starring Baler the Brave, illustrated by Sal Buscema, which tells of some adventures of Balder when he's kind of getting his mojo back and becoming a hero again. But it also further explores the relationship between Balder and the Norn queen Carnella. And it's really interesting. And so the Balder miniseries is included in Walt Simonson's Thor omnibus and in the trade paperbacks as well, which it should be because it's very much a part of the Thor comic book. And here is Thor journeying into hell to rescue the human souls that have been taken there prematurely. And it's just magnificent. Walt Simonson has his own version of the Lady Sif, which is really cool. There she is. Lady Sif, who rules over hell. And Lady Sif and Thor have this gigantic battle where Thor is scarred, apparently. Apparently, Thor has horrific scars and must cover himself up. But to get out of hell, one character has to sacrifice himself by standing at a bridge and holding off the hordes of hell. And that turns out to be a character who was one of the villains from the Thor comic book. And that is the Executioner. But the Executioner has gone on this journey with Thor and the other Asgardians to kind of prove his worth. And he sacrifices himself using these machine guns that the Asgardians took from Earth. You know, it's the 80s, so you have to have, you know, a nice Rambo moment where somebody's using machine guns. And of course, the Executioner is the perfect person for that. And we get this very celebrated image that, if I can hold it up, of the Executioner and the Executioner's last stand in hell. Fantastic. What a way to go out. And so we have this redemption arc for this character, the Executioner. And as far as I'm aware, the Executioner never returned. I think he stayed in hell. I think we got glimpses of him in hell. But I think that was it. And I think I'm getting to the point where Thor is a frog. Yes, we have all of these adventures of Thor as a frog in New York. You know what? Walt Simonson, he took this book in some interesting directions. There's Thor as the mighty Thor frog, where he battles Loki as a giant frog. You know, it all works. It all works. Now, eventually, Balder the Brave he is chosen to take over for Odin in Asgard. Thor grows a beard. Apparently, his scars were just like little scars on his chin, and that he could just grow a beard and cover them up. And by this point, Sal Buscema has taken over the book. And like I said, Sal Buscema, he was really good. And he just did excellent work on this book, on Thor. But it was a pretty big change from Walt Simonson. And I remember when I was reading it, I didn't appreciate the change at the time. I enjoyed it a lot more now because like I said, I'm a fan of Sal Buscema, and I think he did some excellent work on this book. But it was a big change from Walt Simonson. But Walt Simonson does return in this fantastic issue where Walt Simonson fights the Midgard serpent. And Walt Simonsons Thor fights the Midgard serpent. And Walt Simonson does the artwork. And he creates new battle armor for Thor, which he needed because he was cursed and his bones had become brittle. So he needed battle armor. And it's just fantastic. This whole issue with it's told all in splash pages, very dramatic ones. And this was Walt Simonson's last work on Thor, and it was just wonderful. It was just a wonderful issue of Thor. And then we have the concluding story where the Destroyer returns. You know, the Destroyer has to return. And the series ends quite heroically, and we have a really interesting last scene where Thor confronts Loki. And I won't give away what happens at the very end of the run, but it was wonderful. This was a wonderful run of Thor. It has some of the highest moments in the entire series, as dramatically. And Walt Simonson really understood how to make a great Thor comic book, where you can have intimate character moments, but you can also have this magnificent pageantry of Asgard and the high stakes wars and invasions and monsters and super powerful villains and all of that, which really is unique to this comic book. There's really no other comic book quite like Thor when Thor is done well, and nobody ever did it better than Walt Simonson. Okay, guys, I will shut up now, and I will catch you next time.